At the time of writing this, there are approximately 400 pieces of fanfiction on AO3 that are about Benvolio and Mercutio as lovers. However, none of those pieces are tagged yaoi. And I'm here to fix that. Hello, hi, welcome back to Mia Likes Movies. My name is Mia and I like movies. I like a lot of other things too, but Mia Likes Movies just sounded the best. Welcome to my new series, Can It Yaoi? A series in which we analyze characters in classical literature and ask the vital question, can it yaoi? How many more times can I say yaoi? This series can and will most likely expand to yuri. That is, if that's what you want. First, we will define what yaoi is. Then we will analyze the text, and finally we will answer the question that I have been asking too many times already. Can Benvolio yaoi? Hey guys, Editing Mia here. Sorry for the change in quality. I just wanted to point out a couple of things, some disclaimers that I forgot to record when I had my setup. What I wanted to say was I don't consider myself a yaoi fan, a frequent yaoi enjoyer. I'm using it as clickbait. I'm just gonna put that out there. Could I have called this video, Can It Gay Fan Fiction? Sure, but I feel like it doesn't have the same tang, the same funk, the same flavor as Can It Yaoi. It's just a little bit catchier. Also, I feel like it's a little bit more in the zeitgeist, and also I thought it was funnier. So I just want to say that. So anything I get wrong, it's because I'm not part of that culture. I'm not part of the yaoi culture, actually. I'm really just using it as a sort of substitute for gay fan fiction. And maybe that's incorrect, and maybe you're mad at me for that. I respect it. Okay, but sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do to get clicks, and I'm gonna be honest about that. I think that's it. Okay, bye. First of all, if you know what yaoi is, skip ahead. This section is not for you. I'm going to define it and kind of talk about the history here. You want to stay? Go ahead. In the description, I'll have all the different sections and the time codes there, so feel free to just skip ahead to the analysis part. Thanks. I will also say I have my script here and my camera here, so if I keep looking this way, it's because I'm referencing my script. And also, this is my good side. Just kidding, it's this one actually. Is it? I don't know. Moving on. To be completely honest, it was sort of difficult to get a concrete definition on yaoi, and that's because of a couple reasons. The genre originated about 50 years ago and has evolved and changed so much over time. Another reason is that Western yaoi fans have a different definition and relationship to the genre than Eastern fans, which is where it originates. And finally, yaoi at its core is just fiction about gay relationships, but to talk about the nuances of it and find the definition of the nuances that brings it beyond just gay fanfic was a little tough. I'll just say that. So I'm going to explain to you from my best understanding what I believe and what I interpret yaoi to be, but please correct me in the comments below if I am wrong. I also want to state I don't know Japanese, okay? Just putting that all out there now. The article from Shonen Ai to Yaoi, The History of Boys Love by Jonathan Greenall for CBR was most helpful to me during my research, and I highly recommend reading it if you are interested in learning more. It will be linked along with all of my other sources in the description below, so feel free to check that out. According to the Yaoi wiki, which yes, is a thing, yaoi is, quote, a Japanese genre of fictional media focusing on relationships between male characters. Originally, it was aimed at a female audience and was usually created by female authors, but has since influenced many authors and reached out to other audiences, end quote. Essentially, yaoi is a genre of self-published works of fiction that focus on male-male relationships, specifically sexual relationships between two male characters. One is typically larger in stature, more masculine presenting and dominant, while the other is typically lithe in stature, more feminine presenting and submissive. The genre formally developed in the 1970s in Japan, although there have always been works of gay fiction throughout history in Japan and all over the world. The genre just so happened to reach a certain point of popularity in Japan in the 1970s that they created a name specifically for it then. So the word yaoi is essentially a portmanteau, or like an abbreviation and combination of the Japanese words yamanashi, ochinashi, iminashi, which means no climax, no point, no meaning in English. This basically refers to the fact that yaoi works will typically focus heavily on sex with very little focus on other things like plot or character development. So kind of like erotica, basically. Yaoi is also sometimes referred to as boys love, which I feel that term is self-explanatory, boys love. However, the term boys love came around about 20 years later after yaoi to serve as a sort of umbrella term for yaoi and other similar genres such as tanbi, junei, or bara, which we won't get into for the point of this video. It's not super relevant. Again, what makes yaoi different from these other boys love subgenres is the fact that yaoi focuses intensely on sex over plot and character. That doesn't mean that yaoi can't have those things, especially now, but the origin of the term and genre does originate from that fact. That being said, these terms are pretty interchangeable, especially in the Western world, and it seems like yaoi has become the preferred way to refer to these works with English-speaking young audiences. So what makes a story yaoi? Well, you need two male characters, a seam or a seme and an uke or a top and a bottom respectively. This is ridiculous. This actually might be the most ridiculous video I've ever made, which is saying a lot. The seam is typically the more masculine, overtly strong character. They typically have more restrained emotions and are protective in nature. And the uke is typically smaller with more androgynous or even overtly feminine features depending on the story. They are also usually physically weaker and more emotional and will typically be the one pursuing the seam. The Wikipedia article for yaoi goes into great detail about this. Great detail. So if you want to know more, please go on and head over there because I don't know how much more I can describe without getting this video demonetized. So obviously there are works that play around or even subvert these tropes, but these are the defining character traits and tropes that are typically found throughout the genre, especially in earlier yaoi works. There's also some overlap with the Omegaverse community, which is a question I actually had when I first started doing my research. There's proof here. I used Milanote for my research and this is a screenshot. So the answer is yes, there is some overlap there and you can actually find Omegaverse yaoi pieces of fiction out there. For those who are wondering. It's also important to note that female characters are not often super present or developed in yaoi works. This is especially true in earlier yaoi works, but it has since changed in recent years. Yaoi has been accused of being very misogynistic and homophobic, as it can have unrealistic or harmful depiction of women or gay men. Those that are a fan of this genre tend to argue that works in this genre seem to exist in a sort of fantasy and or escapist universe that is similar yet different to our own, that plays with gender expression, gender roles, and sexual fantasies. I think all of these things can sort of exist at the same time. Since art is inherently fantastical in its creation, but not entirely separate from the societal implications placed upon the creator and the consumer. So we can acknowledge that some yaoi is problematic in its depiction of male-male relationships, while also acknowledging that yaoi is a genre that was specifically created by women for women to explore their own personal fantasies. I also want to note that there is another boys love subgenre called bara, which I had mentioned earlier, that is created primarily by gay men for a gay male audience. So I do see yaoi as something that caters more so to a female audience and female fantasies than a gay audience or gay fantasies, which I do think is an important distinction to make. As someone who is on Tumblr at the ripe old age of 11, I have read my fair share of gay fanfiction. Did some fetishize gay men? Yeah, sure. But a lot of it did not. For me, I was really uncomfortable with my own body and sexuality at this age, so male-male fanfiction actually helped me explore my sexuality in a way that felt sort of removed from my body and made me more comfortable exploring those fantasies that I had. For others, they can even explore their own queerness or gender identity through these works and the way that they explore gender and sex. Like any other genre, there are going to be pieces that do uphold certain problematic ideals, but there are also going to be some that don't, or some that even subvert these ideals. So then there's also the question of doomed yaoi or toxic yaoi.
What is toxic yaoi?
Typically, the modifier of toxic is most often reserved for yuri ships, but it can and does often show itself in yaoi works. Doomed yaoi is a yaoi relationship in which the relationship ends in some sort of tragedy, usually due to outside forces. Most often, one or even both of the men will die. That being said, it doesn't have to end in death. It can just end in them breaking up. Essentially, doomed yaoi is yaoi that is destined to fail. Toxic yaoi is, as the name suggests, yaoi that focuses on a toxic male-male relationship. Perhaps it's a sort of enemies to lovers, or both men are horrible people, or there may even be some abuse or manipulation present in the relationship. Not all yaoi is doomed yaoi or toxic yaoi, and not all doomed yaoi is toxic yaoi, and not all toxic yaoi is doomed yaoi, but there can be some overlap in these subgenres. So hopefully now you understand what yaoi is, so we can start our analysis of Benvolio and Mercutio's relationship in Romeo and Juliet. My rules for Can It Yaoi are as follows. 1. The two male characters interact in a way that can be interpreted as homoerotic. 2. One character can be interpreted as the seam and the other as the uke. First, we will look at each scene in which Benvolio and or Mercutio appear. After that, we will dig deeper into them as individual characters to see if they can fit into the yaoi archetypes of seme and uke. Finally, we will decide if it can qualify as doomed or toxic yaoi. Obviously, this portion will be highly subjective, as all I have to go off of is Shakespeare's text. But that's the beauty of Shakespeare, and the fact that it is public domain. I can literally do whatever I want with it. So I am going to argue that Benvolio is doomed yaoi, and that Benvolio is the seam, and Mercutio is the uke. It's what Shakespeare would have wanted. So Benvolio and Mercutio actually only appear in the first 3 acts of the play, out of 5 in total, and they only appear in 5 scenes together overall. Benvolio appears in 2 more scenes than Mercutio in the beginning of the play, which helped to introduce the audience to Romeo and the overall world of the play. We'll start with these Benvolio scenes for this very reason. So Act 1, Scene 1 introduces us to Shakespeare's Verona. We see Capulets and Montagues fighting. Benvolio appears as the fight begins to break out and tries to stop the men from killing each other, saying, "I do but keep the peace." However, when Tybalt appears and taunts him, Benvolio does not back down from a challenge. Eventually, Prince Aeschylus arrives and tells everyone to stop fighting or they will be punished by death. Benvolio then talks to Lady and Lord Montague about the fight, and the conversation quickly turns to their son, Romeo, who has been depressed as of late for reasons unknown to any of the 3 of them. Romeo then ends up turning up, and Benvolio tells Lady and Lord Montague that he'll figure out what the issue is. While talking to Romeo, Benvolio finds out that Romeo is upset because the woman he has a crush on, named Rosaline, has sworn herself to chastity, most likely becoming a nun of sorts. Romeo is sad because he'll never have a chance with her, because she's a nun. Benvolio tells Romeo, "Be ruled by me, forget to think of her." Romeo responds, "Oh, teach me how I should forget to think." And Benvolio says, "By giving liberty unto thine eyes, examine other beauties." Or basically, forget about that bitch and go look at some other women. Romeo says that that's not an option, but Benvolio takes this as a challenge. So that all happens in Act 1, Scene 1, which is a very long scene. That sort of makes sense as there's a lot of exposition to set up for the rest of the plot to make sense. So we learn that Benvolio is a Montague and has some close relation to Romeo. Benvolio calls Lord Montague his noble uncle, and he calls Romeo his fair cuz, meaning proper cousin, not hot cousin, for the record. We also learn that Benvolio is quick to anger, at least when it comes to the Capulets, because it does not take him much to stop from keeping the peace and fighting Tybalt and the other Capulets in the first part of the scene. We also see Benvolio try to cheer Romeo up by encouraging him to examine other beauties, something he finds excitement in. This sort of attitude continues on into the second scene. In Act 1, Scene 2, Romeo and Benvolio are walking the streets when they stumble upon one of the Capulet servants tasked with handing out invitations to the next Capulet masquerade. Romeo helps the servant read the invitation as the servant doesn't know how to read, and the servant thanks him by inviting him to the party, not knowing that Romeo and Benvolio are Montagues. While reading the invitation, they find out that Rosaline, Romeo's crush, has been invited to the party, and that their friend Mercutio has also been invited, but most importantly that Rosaline has been invited. Mercutio is invited because he's actually related to Prince Aeschylus, who, if you remember from Scene 1, was the guy that came in and told everyone to stop fighting and that they would be punished by death. Contrary to popular belief, Mercutio is not a Montague, but he's rather Princekin. Benvolio sees this party as the perfect opportunity to help Romeo get over Rosaline. He says, "At this same ancient feast of Capulet sups the fair Rosaline, whom thou so loves, with all the admired beauties of Verona. Go thither, and with an unattained eye, compare her face with some that I shall show, and I will make thee think thy swan a crow." Basically, Benvolio tells Romeo that he hasn't seen Rosaline in comparison to other women, so how does he know if she's really that hot? The Capulet party is going to have some of the hottest, richest women in Verona, so they should go so Romeo can see that Rosaline is not the best that Verona has to offer, and so he can move on to the next girl. Romeo agrees to go to the party, but not to compare Rosaline, but to at least try and see her there. It is at this point that I will say that I do sort of see Benvolio as a bit of a frat boy in some ways. He blusters in the first scene that he's just trying to keep the peace, but then immediately begins to fight the first person of status that calls him out on his bluff. Then he spends the rest of the next 2 scenes convincing his best friend to get over a girl by trying to find a hotter woman to fuck. Tell me that is not typical frat boy behavior. You can't. So Act 1, Scene 4 is our first scene of the trio that is Romeo, Benvolio, and Mercutio. In this scene, they are on their way to the Capulet masquerade, but Romeo's reluctance to go is keeping them from going. Benvolio keeps trying to tell him that they are going to lay low and that if they hesitate any longer, they're going to miss the party. Romeo is still sulking, and Mercutio butts in to try and sort of pump him up. This is where we get the iconic Queen Mab speech. And a lot of people argue about the purpose of the Queen Mab speech and why it is even there in the play to begin with, because in all honesty, it is quite long and full of nonsense and doesn't really have a huge effect on the plot overall. But alas, that is the point. It tells us a lot about Mercutio's character. He's long-winded and full of references. He's using this long speech as a distraction to cheer him up enough to go to the party. It is also nonsensical because he's trying to tell Romeo that dreams are nonsense and are not a good enough reason to not live life to the fullest. After the speech, Benvolio tells the boys that they need to get going or they are going to miss the party because the party will be over. So this Benvolio and Mercutio tag team works, and Romeo reluctantly agrees to continue on to the party. Act 1, Scene 5 is the Capulet Masquerade. Benvolio and Mercutio are in this scene technically, but they don't really do or say anything. I mean, after Romeo kisses Juliet, Benvolio tells him to be gone because the sport is at the best, meaning that the party is dying or the best of the night is over, however you want to interpret that line. But besides that, Benvolio and Mercutio are kind of just there. Shakespeare has famously very little stage direction, so not even that can help us to determine what they are doing. Mercutio was actually invited, so he has a little bit more freedom to be doing whatever he wants at the party. He doesn't even have to be masked or hide himself. Benvolio does not have that freedom as a Montague. That being said, considering what he told Romeo in the previous 3 scenes, we can assume that Benvolio is probably chatting up women either for himself or as like a wingman to Romeo. I like to think that Mercutio is probably just dancing and drinking. After all, his introductory line in Act 1, Scene 4 is, "Nay, gentle Romeo, we must have you dance." To which Romeo responds, "Not I, believe me, you have dancing shoes with nimble soles," which implies that Mercutio may often dance at parties or in life in general. Also, like I said before, he is actually invited to the party so he can drink and dance without fear of getting caught and or killed. That's my interpretation of what they may be doing in this scene, but there's so little to go off if you could really argue that either of them could be doing literally anything. Let me know what you think they're doing at the party in the comments below. So the next scene, Act 2, Scene 1, is presumably the following morning, and Benvolio and Mercutio are trying to find Romeo because they lost him. He has apparently sort of run away from them for some unknown reason. Mercutio says, "He is wise, and on my life hath stolen him home to bed." This implies that Mercutio would rather be sleeping because probably he is tired from the night before or even hungover. Again, pushing my agenda that Mercutio was drinking and dancing all night long. Benvolio asks Mercutio to help call out to Romeo to get his attention, and Mercutio does a whole conjuring bit, and eventually they give up, assuming that Romeo doesn't want to be found. We get a good look at Benvolio and Mercutio's dynamic alone in this scene. It seems that Benvolio is the more serious one, as he's trying to find Romeo in earnest, calling for him, trying to rein Mercutio in with very little flowery language. Mercutio, on the other hand, is putting on a performance using silly voices and talking of women, using metaphors, allusion, and a lot of symbolism in his speech. The next scene, Act 2, Scene 4, Benvolio and Mercutio are sort of gossiping. They still haven't found Romeo, and Benvolio tells Mercutio that Romeo didn't come home last night and Tybalt sent Romeo a letter challenging him to a duel. Benvolio thinks that Romeo will answer Tybalt's challenge, but Mercutio says, yeah, he'll answer his letter, but he's not going to answer his challenge. Mercutio also calls Tybalt the Prince of Cats, which is a reference to Reynard the Fox, which is an old fable about a trickster fox spirit named Reynard. In that fable, there was a literal prince of cats named Tybalt. So basically, Mercutio is calling Tybalt an uppity, rich guy with no real battle experience, because that's kind of like what the character was. Anyway, I've always interpreted it as Mercutio calling Tybalt a queen, like Prince of Cats. And I'm not entirely wrong by that. Like, for example, Mercutio rants to Benvolio after that, saying, "Oh, he's the courageous captain of compliments. He fights as you sing, prick song, keeps time, distance, and proportion." Shakespeare uses consonants here, repeating this sound, which can create a sort of lisping sound, which can almost sound like a gay lisp. So textually, there may be some evidence to come to that conclusion. And in fact, Mercutio actually goes on, "The pox of such antic lisping affecting phantasmes, these new tuners of accent." Phantasmes refers to a person who is extremely imaginative and fanciful. Again, Mercutio is using effeminate language to describe Tybalt, emasculating him to Benvolio. So like I said, I like to think that Mercutio is calling Tybalt a queer, but interpret it as you will. So Romeo ends up coming in and interrupting this conversation, and Mercutio accuses Romeo of running away from them last night. Romeo denies this, but Mercutio continues with the accusations. They go back and forth for a while, and Mercutio admits, "Why, is not this better now than groaning for love? Now art thou sociable, Now art thou Romeo. Benvolio stops Mercutio from going on, and then the three are interrupted by Juliet's nurse and a Capulet servant. The three of them then decide to make fun of her for being old and poor and uneducated. It's really cruel, actually. That poor woman. Mercutio and Benvolio end up leaving, which leaves Romeo alone to talk to her, so she can talk to him about his marriage to Juliet, unbeknownst to the two of them. Next, we see our boys in Act 3, Scene 1, which is a doozy. I am so sorry. Benvolio and Mercutio are once again hanging out, sort of gossiping. Benvolio says that they should retire as it's hot outside, which could lead to a fight, and there's a lot of Capulets around. Mercutio says that Benvolio is bold to say that, as Benvolio is as soon moved to be moody and as soon moody to be moved, saying what I've basically been saying this whole time, which is he's quick to fight when he's threatened, as we saw in the very first scene of the play with Tybalt. Wouldn't you know it, Tybalt and his men show up, and they are looking for Romeo. Mercutio gets annoyed with Tybalt, and Benvolio tells them both that they should either find a private place to fight or leave altogether. After all, if you can remember, the prince threatened any Montagues and Capulets with death if they fought again in public. Mercutio says, men's eyes are made to look, and let them gaze. I will not budge for no man's pleasure, I. And then Romeo walks in. Tybalt challenges him to a fight, but Romeo says no, saying that he loves him better than he can even imagine. This is because in the scene before, Romeo and Juliet actually get married by Friar Lawrence, so now by marriage, Romeo and Tybalt are family, technically. Mercutio gets upset with Romeo for turning down the fight and chooses to fight Tybalt himself. As they fight, Romeo tries to break the fight apart, basically, and Mercutio actually ends up getting stabbed under Romeo's arm. Mercutio makes some jokes about being hurt, but it's actually very apparent that he is seriously and gravely injured. It was unfortunately a fatal stabbing. He wishes a plague upon both houses before retreating off stage with Benvolio. Benvolio ends up coming back on to announce that Mercutio has unfortunately passed away, saying, "Oh, Romeo, Romeo, brave Mercutio is dead. That gallant spirit hath aspired the cloud, which too untimely here did scorn the earth." Romeo, pissed, challenges Tybalt, ultimately slaying him. Benvolio tells Romeo to run away before he gets caught, and he does so. And soon after, the prince ends up arriving with Montague, Capulet, and their wives. Benvolio recounts the whole story of that scene, and the lords and ladies fight with the prince, trying to each seek justice for their friends and kin. The prince ends up deciding that since Tybalt did slay Mercutio and Romeo slayed Tybalt, the only fair thing to do in this situation would be to banish Romeo from Verona. And that's all the scenes that have Benvolio and Mercutio in the play. They are not seen for the rest of the play. Some directors will replace a minor character by the name of Balthasar in Act 4 and 5 with Benvolio, but textually, Benvolio does not come back after Mercutio's death. Now that we've done a quick rundown of Benvolio and Mercutio's relationship and interactions in the show, let's answer the ultimate question of can it yaoi? While stating my thesis, I also stated my 2 rules for determining if something can yaoi. 1, the 2 male characters interact in a way that can be interpreted as homoerotic. And 2, one character can be interpreted as the sim and the other as the uke. So let's start with the first one. Do Benvolio and Mercutio interact in a way that can be determined or interpreted as homoerotic? We only have one scene between the two of them that is not interrupted by Romeo or other characters, and that is Act 2, Scene 1, after the party when they are hungover looking for Romeo. I'm going to play a video example here.
That in thy likeness thou appear to us.
Shh. And if he hear thee, thou wilt anger him.
This cannot anger him. 'Twould anger him to raise a spirit in his mistress's circle of some strange nature, letting it there stand till she had laid it and conjured it down.
Come. He hath hid himself among these trees to be consorted by the night. Blind is his love, and best befits the dark.
If love be blind, love cannot hit the mark. Good night.
Oh, I'll to my truckle bed. This field bed is too cold for me to sleep. Come. Shall we go?
Go then. For 'tis in vain to seek him here that means not to be found.
So this scene is mostly Mercutio talking at Benvolio's request to help conjure Romeo. Benvolio does eventually sort of stop him, but that's after Mercutio puts on a whole show. And that's the thing about the two of them. In almost every instance of them interacting, Mercutio is putting on some sort of show and Benvolio just sort of lets him. I also think the beginning of Act 3, Scene 1, when Benvolio and Mercutio are talking, Mercutio says that Benvolio is quick to fight. Benvolio asks, "Am I like such a fellow?" Mercutio answers, "Come, come, thou art as hot a jack in thy mood as any in Italy." Benvolio keeps asking him to describe himself. This back and forth can be sort of flirty, like when you're asking your crush what they think of you. Then when the scene turns, who is it that carries Mercutio out to his deathbed? Who comes back to announce his death? And who stays to ensure that the truth is told to the prince and justice is served for the death of Mercutio? Benvolio. So I do think there are some grounds for homoeroticism between the two of them. Now on to the second statement. One character can be interpreted as the seam and the other as the uke. If you remember, a seam and an uke is essentially the top and the bottom respectively. The seam is typically more masculine, this overtly strong character. They usually have more restrained emotions and are protective in nature. Uke is usually smaller and more androgynous or even overtly feminine. They also are usually physically weaker than the seam and are more emotional and will be often the one pursuing the seam. And I'd like to argue that Benvolio is the seam and Mercutio is the uke. So Benvolio is the top and Mercutio is the bottom. I sound so ridiculous saying this. I have a degree in theater. I have 2 technically. I am using my degree here. I taught Shakespeare for 2 years. So we've established several times that Benvolio is a bit hot-headed, and I've already talked about how I see him as a sort of frat boy-esque character. Between him and Mercutio, he does sort of come off as more masculine. His lines are actually fairly simple, and he rarely uses imaginative language that has like a lot of imagery or motifs or very like apparent literary devices. He doesn't show a ton of emotion until after Mercutio dies. Like, his biggest emotions are horny in the first couple of scenes and then annoyed. He's also clearly protective, as our introduction to him as a character is him fighting on behalf of the Montagues in the first scene and then telling Lord and Lady Montague not to worry. He will figure out what is wrong with Romeo. So I guess one of the biggest questions then is Mercutio physically weaker than Benvolio? Well, I'll just ask this. Who's still alive by the end of the play? Most people stage it so that Benvolio and Tybalt are the ones fighting in Act 1, Scene 1 at the beginning of the play, and both do walk away alive. But Mercutio does lose to Tybalt, and sure, Romeo interfered, but the first scene was a bloodbath with the amount of people that were fighting. So if you kind of look at it this way, in this fighting 2 degrees removed from each other, Mercutio does seem physically weaker than Tybalt and therefore is weaker than Benvolio. Mercutio is also just clearly more emotional. I mean, just look at him in any scene that he's in. He's literally all over the place. He's a mess. He's constantly talking and complaining just like a woman. Kidding. Now, his dialogue is always filled with imagery and puns and wit. He's constantly described as gallant and long-winded. He is messy. So he's clearly the uke. But does Mercutio pursue Benvolio? No, because Shakespeare didn't write that. Duh. And that's where fanfiction comes in, okay? That's the point of this video. I'm not asking, is it yaoi? Obviously it's not yaoi. Shakespeare didn't write a yaoi subplot in Romeo and Juliet. Duh. Duh. I am asking, can it yaoi? Meaning, can you interpret this relationship as yaoi and /or write yaoi fanfic about it? And to that I say yes. So now we determined that Benvolio can yaoi. We must answer, is it doomed yaoi or is it toxic yaoi, or is it neither? And I think it's sort of clear that it is definitely doomed yaoi. I mean, Mercutio literally dies. And then Benvolio disappears for the rest of the play, probably in mourning for his lover. So doomed yaoi plays on the idea of ill-fated lovers, and Romeo and Juliet is all about ill-fated lovers. So it only makes sense that the yaoi subplot be doomed. But is it toxic? I mean, it can be. Mercutio does seem sort of dominant in the scene, scenes that they are in and can be a bit dismissive of Benvolio, so I can see some potential there, but I think you would have to take a lot of creative liberties to truly flesh that out. So, is Mercutio 1-to-1 doomed Yaoi? No, but there's potential there, and that is the beauty of Shakespeare. Now, this is going to be my Pepe Sylvia moment. If you want to get really big-brained here, it's much more fun to interpret the relationship between Romeo, Mercutio, and Benvolio as a little love triangle. And if you want to get even more big-brained, even more conspiratorial, you can even throw Tybalt in there. But let me explain. Okay, Benvolio is obviously in love with Mercutio. He follows him around like a puppy, letting him talk and joke and do whatever they want while they hang out. But Mercutio can sometimes be dismissive of Benvolio. However, Mercutio is clearly interested in Romeo. So in a blog post for Shakespeare's Globe, yes, the one in England, like the Shakespeare's Globe, entitled Barding the Rainbow, Unveiling Queerness and Camp in Shakespeare in Elizabethan England, which is an essay I will talk about again in my conclusion, they mention that Mercutio's flamboyant presence complicates Romeo's affections, and that their witty banter hints at a deeper bond, leaving us questioning its nature. And this is absolutely a valid interpretation of their character relationship. Most of the scenes with Romeo and Mercutio are them having a battle of wits of sorts, mostly taking jabs about sex and love, which is something that Shakespeare uses often, especially with his lovers. I think about Taming of the Shrew with Caterina and Petruchio, as well as Benedict and Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing. And even Romeo and Juliet in Romeo and Juliet, their first little scene together is a little sonnet where they have some back and forth about pilgrims and kissing. And so like Benvolio is there too, but as we discuss, like in those moments when it's the three of them, he doesn't really say much. In fact, he actually tries to stop it to move the plot along. So let's look at a video example of Act 2, Scene 4.
Come between us, good Benvolio, my wits faint.
Switch and spurs, or I'll cry a match.
Nay, if thy wits run the wild goose chase, I have done. For thou hast more of the wild goose in one of thy wits than I am sure I have in my whole 5. Was I there with you for the goose?
Thou wast not with me for anything when thou was not there for the goose.
I will bite thee by the ear for that
Nay,
jest.
good goose, bite not.
Thy wit is the very bitter sweeting. It is the most sharp sauce.
Is it not well served unto a sweet goose?
Oh, here's a wit of cheverel that stretches from an inch narrow to an ell broad.
I stretch it out for that word broad, which added to the goose proves thee far and wide a broad goose.
Why? Is not this better now than groaning for love? Now thou art sociable, now thou art Romeo. Now art thou what thou art by art as well as by nature. For this driveling love is like a great natural who runs lolling up and down to hide his bubble in a hole.
Stop there. Stop there.
Their whole exchange is sexually charged in their witty banter, making sexual puns to one another. Mercutio even says, "I will bite thee by the ear for that jest," which is just undeniably flirty. I like to think that Benvolio stops them because he's annoyed and jealous. So Romeo does not necessarily feel the same way about Mercutio, as he is actively pursuing Rosalind at the beginning of the play and then immediately moves on to Juliet. That doesn't mean that they don't have a past. I go back and forth on what I feel about Romeo's feelings towards Mercutio in this moment. When I was rereading the play, I kind of didn't see Romeo interested in Mercutio, but you could kind of go either way. Romeo's love for Juliet does annoy Mercutio, for he says, "For this driveling love is like a great natural that runs lolling up and down to hide his bauble in a hole," which is basically just saying you're just crying because you want to get your dick wet. Romeo doesn't really hear this comment though, because the nurse then comes in right away and is searching for him and he gets distracted. So yeah, I like to think that Benvolio is in love with Mercutio and Mercutio is in love with Romeo and Romeo loves Juliet. Where does Tybalt fit into all of this? Well, remember when I brought up that I like to think that Mercutio calls Tybalt a queer? Well, okay. A big question I have always asked when reading Romeo and Juliet, even back when I was a freshman in high school when I first read it, why is Mercutio even hanging out with Romeo and Benvolio. Like, he's princekin. He could, in theory, be hanging out with literally anyone else. So why does he choose to hang out with Montagues? If you can remember, Mercutio was actually invited to the Capulet party, again because he is related to the prince. But everyone kind of knows that he hangs out with Montagues, a tricky situation. Mercutio expresses immediate disdain for Tybalt when Benvolio brings him up in Act 2, Scene 4. The same scene I keep talking about where Mercutio calls Tybalt the Prince of Cats. What if Tybalt and Mercutio dated or hooked up in the past and had a nasty breakup? Despite Tybalt, Mercutio starts hanging out with Romeo and Benvolio, but mostly Romeo, in order to get back at Tybalt. And that's why Mercutio hangs out with the Montagues, and that's why he and Tybalt dislike each other. I think I need to go write fan fiction. So what was the point of this? Why does it matter if these two minor Shakespeare characters have a homoerotic connection? Well, everything. Back in the Elizabethan era, there was actually more fluidity in sexuality than we may have realized. In the aforementioned blog post for Shakespeare's Globe, they state, quote, "While Shakespeare's characters might express emotions we see as queer today, they wouldn't have necessarily identified that way themselves owing to a lack of language to describe it. Instead of a rigid binary of forbidden or allowed, Elizabethan society navigated a spectrum of intimacy and affection. People dismiss old classic literature as boring or elitist, and I understand where those claims come from. White Western academics have sort of co-opted Shakespeare and other classic writers, making them feel less and less accessible to the general public. However, Shakespeare was always for the masses, and Shakespeare was always queer. Shakespeare was allegedly queer himself. If you read some of his sonnets, you'll know this. I wanted to do this video because I love Shakespeare, but I also want other people to love it too, to really engage with it and see it as more as this unreadable nonsense. It's poetry, it's drama, and most of all, it's fun. I thought that by showing you how you can look at these iconic characters through a queer lens, I might be able to inspire others to do so as well. Plus, the concept of yaoing Shakespeare just made me laugh, and I hope it made you laugh too. Like, it's not that serious, but also it kind of is. Also, a funny thing is, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but whatever. I've done Romeo and Juliet 3 times since 2001, and I'm going to be doing it again this spring. But this time I'm actually going to be playing Benvolio, and I started writing this script. I had auditioned for the show, but I didn't have the callback yet when I started writing this, and then I got the callback and they had me read for Benvolio and Mercutio, and then I started reading the script more and like writing my script more, and then as I was finishing the script I got the call that I would be cast as Benvolio, which is my first time playing a Montague. So it's just really funny divine timing with all of this. So if you're gonna be in the central Pennsylvania area in May, come see me as Benvolio, maybe? That's gonna be super fun. I'm really excited. I can't wait to talk to whoever is playing Mercutio about our homoerotic relationship. That's gonna be really fun. Maybe I'll just show them this video. I won't, but what if I did? All that to say, thank you so much for watching. I have been doing these polls for each video monthly, and so this week's poll was a simple Yuri or Yaoi. You all said Yuri, resoundingly. So that sucks for this video. If you want to see more of this series, Can It Yaoi, let me know. I find it really fun, and I would love to do a Horatio Hamlet breakdown if you would allow me. Friendly reminder to like, subscribe, and comment, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Goodbye. Or should I say adieu? No, I should say goodbye. 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 Parting is such sweet sorrow that I shall say goodnight till it be morrow. I think that's right. Bye.